Welcome back, everybody. Great to have you all here. I'm Vicky Robbins, and I'm part of the innovation team at Oxford City Council. I'm absolutely delighted to present three really ground-changing speakers here today that are going to really contribute to that whole EV infrastructure going forward, whether it's through the LEVI bid or beyond. We've got Matt Ling, who's from Suffolk Council, who's going to be talking about the community-based solutions and innovative ways that he's leveraged land assets in his area. We've got Martin Schäferbarthold, who's here from Solihull, who's come up with a really novel way to bring other public sector organisations into the mix for delivery and the utilisation of their land. And then we've got Hannah Budnitz from Oxford University here, who's going to talk about e-mobility and the research that's done here. So, first to the stage, I'd like to invite Matt.
Morning. So my name is Matthew. I'm Suffolk County Council. I wonder how many of you know much about Suffolk. Do you know where it is on the east of England? You know, we are proud that we have the largest container port in the country. We have Ed Sheeran. We have Snape Maltings, one of the finest orchestras, performance space that you would ever want. We have a football club which compares with no other one, has produced Alf Ramsey and so many famous footballers, apart from the Canaries just up the road. But did you know also that we have one of the first community-based car charging hubs in the country? The first one which we leveraged community assets to benefit the local community so they could charge their vehicles, to lead the way so they knew where they were going rather than waiting to catch up like so many rural places. Suffolk is a mainly rural place. It's got about 800,000 people, 330,000 homes. About 25% of those homes have no off-street parking. There is a challenge for that. It's a destination place. Earlier this summer, we had the Secretary of State for Transport send us a letter saying, can you make sure that there's enough charging for tourists over the summer when they arrive and visit Southwold or Aldborough? We've got lots of challenges, but we also know we've got lots of opportunities. And the people who live in those communities are the most important asset that we've got. Now, I wanted to start off by just saying we have to learn from where we are, know where we are, and know where we're going to. So on the Ipswich Felixstowe Vintage Historic Rally this year, I saw this wonderful old vehicle on the left-hand side there. This was built somewhere in the 1920s. There was not sufficient infrastructure there for it to fuel up when it needed to. So what was the solution? It was to carry the petrol on the running board. The one in the middle is the launch of a land lease that the council did with Fastned to have one of the first ultra-rapid hubs in Suffolk. I parked up my Morris van there for contrast. It was the most abysmal day. I don't know whether Tom's here at all, but he'll remember and he'll recount how the snow was coming horizontally. It was amazing. I put my vehicle there, 1965, 1098, about 10 horsepower, because I know that if that vehicle was built now, it would have a battery that drove it. And if there's any aspiring converters who want to convert it to electric, please talk to me afterwards. But that hub, as I've seen it happen over the last 6 months, has been one of the busiest places in that part of Ipswich. Every time I go by, I look at it, see how many cars, and I smile because it's being used. It's drawing people to charge up rapidly as they need en route to somewhere else. It's next to a park and ride, which I know Vicky et al. Have done within Oxford, so it serves a number of different purposes. Knowing where we're going is important, and we're looking at contracts for the LEVI funding of maybe 10, 15 years. That was the nearest I could come to an autonomous vehicle, a remote control car. In 10 years' time, is that going to be the future in Suffolk, in your urban area? In 15 years' time, what's it going to look like? How do we make sure we have something which is fit for purpose in the future? So as far as a community-based scheme, there's a whole lot of benefits. What we want to do, and what we wanted to do, is to get people involved. So there's ownership locally, so they know the value, so that they can assist with promoting EVs and EV ownership. We may be in a rural area, but connectivity is key. In our urban areas, air quality is a problem. Cost of ownership is an issue. The more rural you are, the more it costs you to get to work. We've done it because we want to get and experience what works, what doesn't work, the best model, so as we go forward, we get better. So our community hubs are based in village halls, parish halls, leisure centres, places where people go and use in villages. They're places where that top right-hand picture shows, that's Coddenham, just about 10 miles from Ipswich, where there is no off-street parking. You might think in a rural area, it's not a problem. Let me tell you, it is. If you went to the centre of Ipswich, the Victorian houses demonstrate there's a problem with charging. We need to get it right. We need to get it so that it's accessible and realistic. So our community hub, our models of putting chargers in our locations, means that the local community operates it. They own the asset. It means they can change the tariff so that people aren't disadvantaged. It means that I'm not going to be charged 89p like I might be at an Instavolt, even though often I get a chance to have McDonald's when I'm there. But it does mean that if you're a local, you might get a better deal. You might be able to go and get a free cup of coffee from the community coffee shop. This is not large-scale rollout, but this is a way of serving the local communities and giving them the identity and the way that they can actually work forward. Why was it so special? First in the country, I said. Contactless app, RFID. Did I say contactless? These are 7 kilowatt chargers. Yes, we think that what people want is to make it easy. So why confuse it? It's got to be easy to use. Is it accessible? Yes, it's got to be accessible. Is it 1899 compliant? Quite a few of them are. Is that what we want? Absolutely. It should be by exception that these things aren't accessible. It should be exception that these things aren't inclusive. We don't want anyone left behind on this. It needs to work. It's got to work. There's got to be no surprises. It's a little bit dark there, but one of my sad occupations, I go around and check every charger that I ever see when I'm driving around, just for fun, really. This charger, these 2 charging stations, I was not so happy at the end of it, because there was a pre-authorisation charge. I ended up with nearly £500 worth of pre-authorisation charges on a charge point because it wasn't working properly. That's just outrageous. It's a screenshot from my phone. How many apps do I really need? I don't. I really don't. I want it to be easy. If I, as an EV driver, as leading a team of EV infrastructure implementers at Suffolk, get fed up with this, a normal person in the street in Suffolk is just going to stop and find a different solution. We know that we need to give drivers support in these community situations. We know we've got to help the local organisations to promote what they've got. But on our side, we've got their accessibility, we've got their cooperation, we've got their enthusiasm. They know their communities better than we do, and we think we know them quite well. We have learned some lessons. Legacy equipment. We've been going for 3 or 4 years now. We've had 3 generations of charging unit. Looking forward, going through to 15 years' time, how many times are we going to have to update equipment? How many times are we going to have to update back office? Is it OCCP 24 compliant, 54 compliant? Where are we going to be in 10 years' time? Will it work? If not, who's going to pay for it? How do we do that? How do we monitor what's going on in Suffolk with our charge points? We've got to future-proof it. We've got to make sure that what we've got works, and we've got to know it works, and make sure it delivers that 99% uptime. And it's got to be good value for money for the consumers. As a local authority, we're not in it for the money. I'm told that some charge point operators are. Perhaps that's right, but we need to work with you to make sure that we have systems in place, infrastructure in place that delivers what's best for our local communities. We have a plan. We published our EV infrastructure strategy this week for the whole of Suffolk. It's not perfect, but it gives an idea of the path that we're going. It shows us where we're going to go. It shows us at the moment that over half the charge points in Suffolk have been put in by local authorities, an investment of something like £500,000 already and more to come. We now have the challenge of our LEVI pilot, 1.3 million. We have the challenge of the LEVI capital, 5.6 million. How can we use that to get the best for the infrastructure, to make sure it's not just an urban area, make sure it's not just the commercially viable areas, making sure that the fees and tariffs adapt to the people that are going to use it, and still, yes, have a return for the people who are investing. It's a big challenge. There are some things we do not know. Actually, there's an awful lot of things we don't know. But working with you, working cooperatively with you, working with our colleagues like Vicky at Oxford, is a really good way of us getting the best value, the best solution for our communities. So we have a community-based solution that works. We have a community-based solution which people will turn up at. It's destination charging, yes. It's not the transit charging, but it provides a benefit for the communities, and that's really, really positive. Suffolk aspires to be the greenest county. It aspires to be net zero by 2030. If you want to come and see where Ed Sheeran lives, where the Castle on the Hill song was actually composed, if you want to see John Lennon's bungalow on Shingle Street in the bleak, desolate East Coast from that film Yesterday, if you want to see the largest collection of constables and landscape paintings, you can see them in Suffolk, but you can actually go to Flatford Mill and you can see Willie Lott's cottage. You'll only be able to do it if you help us get the best infrastructure in Suffolk. Why live in London when you can live in the greenest county with a community infrastructure that benefits the people that live there? So, come and work with us, because actually it's better than where you are. There's all sorts of things I could talk about, but the team is really important. So I've got a team of probably 4 people now. I tell them, when they've come on board, they've not known much about EVs. I said, the way to do it is come and play. Take out the Zoe, the ZS, the Teslas. Go and see what it's like. See how difficult it is. I sent 2 of my colleagues up to Harrogate for the Fully Charged show in a Zoe. I hid when I came back. Their experience of charging up, what didn't work, where it worked, how they needed to plan their journey, is absolutely essential for us who work in trying to implement it for the general public, because we get the questions, we get the expectations. The team is really important, and we think we've got a team that can deliver that. Probably the last thing I will say, apart from what's on there, is the politics. Suffolk is a county which has become more green over the last 6 months. There's a greater expectations in delivering low carbon sustainability. That is rooted in our communities. They know what works there. They are often just looking after the land for the next generation. They have been there for many generations, so they care about where they are and they want to do it right. Community charging hubs is one solution. It's not the whole solution. The right charger at the right time in the right place, is absolutely key to all of this. But what I would say is the community hubs can form one part of that solution. We can use their land assets. We can gain real benefit from working with the people that live there, love the place, and use it. But don't forget, Suffolk, the greenest county, come and visit and see what you make of it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Matt. I think it's really interesting what he's doing there with the community projects. And it's really interesting, I think, as well about how that local knowledge is driving up utilisation in those charge points, the key points in the whole business case mix. The next person I want to welcome to the stage is Martin Schäferbarthold. He's from Solihull Metropolitan Borough Council, and he's come up with a novel way to bring other partners together to leverage wider use of land use for electric vehicle infrastructure. So, Martin, over to you.
Thank you. And thanks for entertaining us, Matthew. That was good. So I'm not going to sell Solihull as hard as Suffolk, just to manage expectations. I can't take the credit for inventing a cluster member approach, although not many yet have implemented it for public charging infrastructure. So I'm going to talk you through a little bit about what that means, why we in Solihull have chosen it to do that way, and why I think that will work much more broadly and expand the reach of our public charging networks beyond just council assets. So I will talk about Solihull a little bit, but it is only this slide, I promise. So population, just over 200,000, so we are sort of city size, but spread across a 2/3 rural, 1/3 urban and suburban borough. We're kind of that bit that's sandwiched in between Birmingham and Coventry. You've probably driven through it a million times. You won't even realise you're going through Solihull as you pass through a lot of the time. But we are there. There's lots of really interesting stuff as you leave the motorway. So that JLR, Birmingham Airport, Birmingham International Train Station, the NEC, I'm sure you visited it lots of times. You'll see it called Birmingham on the news quite a lot, which irks our councillors no end. Because all the really interesting stuff that happens in Birmingham is actually largely happening in Solihull. But that's where we are. We are right next to them. They're friendly neighbours. We like them, and we are working with them, particularly on our LEVI bid coming up in the new year. So I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. It's a relatively affluent part of the world. It's certainly affluent compared to most of the rest of the West Midlands. The rate of EV ownership is much higher in Solihull than it is elsewhere, but it's still only sort of 5 or 6%, which is not a big number. It's not a big proportion by any stretch, but when you look at the rest of the West Midlands, you've got boroughs on the other side that are down below 1% EV ownership in terms of total penetration. So we're advanced. Part of that is because we've got a lot of Jaguar Land Rover employees driving I-Paces, but actually that's only a relatively small proportion of the number of EVs on the road. It is to do with that affluence. It's the ability that people have got to be able to park on their driveway, charge on their driveway where it is cheapest. Ideally, that's where most of charging should be done, and we think we need less public charging infrastructure as a result of that than perhaps other areas. So Solihull's never going to be the part of the UK that has the most EV charging. What we're trying to do is make sure we've got the right EV charging in the right place, so that people can use it when they're doing something else. And you're never spending time deliberately charging your car. You're charging your car whilst there's something else to do. It's recently become a requirement, effectively, for local authorities to have an EV strategy. Solihull has had one since 2020. We reviewed that. I joined the council in 2021. We spent a lot of time building up knowledge to really flesh out what that strategy actually meant. So we had a published strategy document that had lots of words in it, and it talked a lot about EVs and how they work and how the technology works and what charging might look like, but it didn't really have an action plan. So it was a strategy in theory, but didn't really lead to anything being delivered. So we reviewed that in 2022 and took a much more delivery-focused approach. Because it's only by putting the charging infrastructure in that you enable all of the rest of that EV journey to work, whether that's public charging infrastructure, whether that's depot, workplace charging infrastructure, or whether that's just helping people to understand how you actually charge a vehicle at home. A big part of that piece of work was understanding where the demand would be. It's easy to look at a map and think, okay, there's lots of people that live here, we probably need some charging there. There's not so many people that live here, we probably need less charging there. That's not necessarily how charging demand actually works, really. What you need to understand is how many of those people living in that area can actually charge at home, and we should encourage them where they can potentially put a home EV charge point to put that in place for themselves, or put that in place as part of a package when they buy their car. What we need to fill in as a local authority is those gaps where people don't have the opportunity to do that. So somebody from Field Dynamics in the audience here today, who actually did this modelling exercise with us. So this has helped us to understand at a very, very granular level exactly where those pockets of charging demand are right now, but also ultimately where that charging demand will arise in the future, because there are people that will never be able to charge from their own home. I know we've got a couple of examples of sort of cross-footpath charging channels here today. Actually, that's probably not going to play a very big role somewhere like Solihull, because most of our properties that don't have access to a driveway or a garage are actually recessed way back from the road. So you might have a 10, 15, 20, even 50 metre run before you get to your front door from the street side. So that sort of solution doesn't really work. So we need alternatives that we can bring forward and get the right charging infrastructure still close enough to people, but without necessarily making it as personal as that kind of driveway charging experience might be. Those demand zones aren't a perfect overlay with where we've got our council car parks, but car parks, whether they're owned by the council or not, can play a big part in serving EV charging demand. The street scene in certain areas means it's really difficult to do on-street charging. We've got lots of areas, particularly in the more deprived parts of the borough, where it's virtually impossible to park on street. So you end up with people parking on curbs, parking on patches of grass. You try and persuade a CPO to come and put some charging infrastructure into a location like that. The risk of it being vandalised is quite high. We saw in 2018 when the council tried to roll out a car club in a more deprived part of the borough. The car club was effectively abandoned before it got going because there was so much resistance. This was an EV-only car club that was brought in. The vehicles and the charging infrastructure were vandalised before the car club ever took off because it was the wrong solution in the wrong place at the wrong time. All the right intentions behind it, and actually it was, underneath that, a really good project, and it was the right project to do. It's just some of the decisions that were made in getting to delivery weren't quite right. So we've learnt lessons from that. We've learnt lessons from Oxford and from other councils across the country. And we've tried to implement a strategy that really fills all of the gaps in demand in the places where they actually need filling and sort of prioritise what we deliver on that basis. We did get some funding through the LEVI pilot programme. So I know we've got some people from OZEV and DFT here today. And we've got the guys from Cenex who've been really helpful in terms of the information they're able to provide as part of the LEVI support body. So you can see on the right-hand side that demand zoning. So there's different colours on there. The purple bits are where there's really high demand for on-street charging or an equivalent to on-street charging. On the left, you can see the locations that we're serving through our LEVI pilot programme. That LEVI pilot programme will deliver within Solihull, within our own council assets, 157 charge points, mostly in council-owned car parks. There's a little handful in there that are actually on street or in recessed parking bays close to local amenities. And what we've done is leveraged more slow charging into a car park environment than a CPO might offer in that environment themselves. So it's not something that would be immediately commercially obvious as a solution, but we've put them in the places that we've put them, and you can see where that sort of overlaps with some of the purple spots that are on the map on the right-hand side. What we're doing is displacing some of that on-street demand that we know is really difficult to serve with on-street charging infrastructure. And we're pushing that into the car parks. But we're doing that in a way where people aren't going to be punished by having to pay for parking at the same time. So you'll have single transaction. You're paying only once. Contactless payment by default. You'll be able to pay by other methods if you choose to, but contactless payment on every single charging infrastructure item that goes in through this project. And it's taking that demand away from the street, which does two things. It means you've got charging infrastructure for those people that need to charge in those areas and don't have the opportunity to do that from home. It's within walking distance from where they live. So we've created isochrones around where these particular charging locations will go. So we understand what that catchment area looks like. We know that people can get there without having to go out of the way. And because we're doing that and we're shifting that overnight charging demand into car park locations and off street, we're actually solving a parking problem as well. We're taking those additional cars off the street and making it that little bit easier. What is really obvious from that map, though, is that the pins on the left-hand side don't cover all of the purple spots on the right-hand side. So we need to do more. The lighter blue pins that you see on the map there are the rest of our car park portfolio, essentially. That's the things that we can do with our own land assets without putting stuff explicitly on street. That gets us to quite a broad coverage. Actually, that covers a significant proportion of the charging demand, but it certainly doesn't get us all the way. So what we need is some more land. And councils don't have any money. We're right next to Birmingham, who really don't have any money. So we clearly need an alternative to going out there and just trying to either compulsory purchase land to put charging provision in, or go out and lease land from other people, because we're not in a financial position to be able to do that. We might be able to pass some of that cost through to a CPO if we did that, but that's not really an optimal model from a cost point of view. That's going to lead to more expensive charging ultimately if we tried to push it that route. So what we've done is tried to bring in a cluster member approach. So a cluster member is essentially any public sector organisation, as far as our contract is concerned. So any public sector organisation operating in Solihull can make use of the contract that we've already procured. They don't need to go out and procure a charge point operator. We've done that piece of work for them. They simply sign a cluster member agreement, a land lease agreement where necessary, append that to the contract, and the charging infrastructure goes in on their site without them having to project manage it. There'll be some elements of project management they get involved in because it's on their asset. But ultimately, it allows them to benefit from that contract. We'll deal with the contract management, we'll deal with the sort of painful side of it, and this is where local authorities do need to take some of the revenue from charging infrastructure, because we need to cover these sort of overhead type costs for managing it and making sure it can go in the right place. So that essentially is how that structure works. So the council has a contract with the CPO. The cluster member can review that contract. Where it's a parish council, they really don't have any money. They have even less money than councils, borough councils, or tier 1 authorities do. So what we're doing is we're offering, our legal team are offering a service to the parish councils where, using a Chinese wall, somebody that's not been involved in the EV infrastructure side will review the legals on their behalf, give them impartial advice, get them to a point where they can understand and sign up to that cluster member agreement if they choose to do so. They're under no obligation to do so. But I've had parish councils banging the door down, wanting charging infrastructure in their car parks because they know the value that it'll add to their communities. So that gets us to a slightly better looking picture with lots more pins on the map. Those orange gold coloured pins that you see on the map there overlay pretty well with all of the areas where we've got those sort of purple patches. It's not an absolutely perfect match, but it's pretty damn close to it. We're up to sort of 80% coverage just through this single contract, putting charging infrastructure in locations that we've already identified. We already know that there is a publicly owned asset there, and that might be Transport for West Midlands, have a park and ride site at a train station. It might be a recreation ground owned by a parish council. It might be the NHS hospital, just to the north of the Solihull town centre. Any of those car parks come into play without anybody having to go out and buy anything. And we've covered the purple patches that are there. We're going to rerun the modelling exercise, so Field Dynamics are going to come back in, rerun the numbers, make sure that everything is covering what we think it should be covering, make sure we can revise our strategy and understand what that looks like for the future. So every 2 years now, we'll do that same exercise. We'll review what the strategy is telling us, we'll review the numbers, make sure it stacks up. As we put the charging infrastructure into these locations, you'll see that actually we can do that without putting very much on street. And that's it for me.
We were talking earlier about how we need to have this symbiotic relationship between CPOs and councils, and I think that's the embodiment of it there. Using the council as a broker to unlock new and wider land potential assets to bring into that concession mix gives you as CPOs and middleware providers more access to charging opportunities and more access to revenue. So it's a win-win situation. So I think it's really exciting. We're watching that one very closely. Last the stage, I'd like to introduce you to Hannah Budnitz. Hannah is part of the Transport Studies Unit here at Oxford University, and she's going to be talking to us about e-mobility and car clubs.
Right, thanks very much. Quite hard acts to follow. That was excellent. So yeah, I was actually asked initially just to talk about car clubs, but I can't resist talking about some of the wider things that I've learned in 4 years researching in the electric mobility space in my work at the University of Oxford. I have worked a lot in the local area and with some of the players that are here today, because I started on the Park and Charge project, which installed charging hubs in council car parks around the more rural areas of Oxfordshire, and am still involved in that with a car club trial that I'll talk about towards the end of my presentation. But I've also been working on other aspects of electric mobility and thinking about kind of what are some of almost the mental barriers as much as the physical barriers. And one thing that kind of comes out is that we need to kind of break down silos. We need to think about electric vehicles in all shapes and sizes. They're not just cars, and they're particularly not just private cars, and really sort of looking at the different opportunities, not just saying, oh, well, my colleague over there that does active travel will deal with e-bikes, and my colleague over there that does public transport will deal with buses. But how can we bring that in, not just for the local governments, but also in terms of our discussions with other parties, people providing energy, people providing infrastructure, because a lot of the most innovative things that are happening are around kind of the intersections between transport and energy. That picture is from Taiwan. They've got e-mopeds, although they call them e-scooters, which is a little bit confusing. But that's a battery swap bank that also delivers grid services. Then that was the other picture is from the EVs Are For Everyone Day at Redbridge Park and Ride. And obviously that is got a lot of different things going on there. It's not just about EV charging. Arguably, you could say, if you had to say it was one sort of project, it's actually the energy side of things that led a bit. But it's got the storage, it's got the renewables, it's got the EV charging, it's going to have electric buses, it services heat pumps and things like that. So a lot going on there. And that's where real innovation can happen, is bringing all those different things together. And also giving more opportunities to be inclusive and to think about who else can benefit from different types of services in different ways. A colleague working in Africa gave me those pictures. It's an electric three-wheeler that has a smart battery that can be taken in and out of the vehicle and used to also power other things in the home for the driver. There's the Yogo City is just something that visited Oxfordshire actually, and I missed it, and I was very annoyed about that because there's been electric golf carts and smaller vehicles like that around a lot. Why aren't we deploying them in certain areas? What can they offer for getting people to and from? E-mobility scooters, again, or electric wheelchairs and things like that. They've been around, not really thought about in the same space as electric vehicles and as how we're going to make these services more inclusive or even shared mobility, but it's definitely something that we'd like to see go. So just spent a little bit of time talking about the research project I've been working on for the past couple of years. It's trans-European, so it's not Oxford as our case study here in the UK, it's Bristol, Oslo in Norway, Utrecht in the Netherlands, and Poznan in Poland. And there's research teams in each country, and we've been doing a lot of work both on the policy and governance side, as well as looking at sort of more the demographics and bottom-up perspectives as well. And those cities were chosen, they're very similar in size. They all have big universities as well, which influences not just the fact that we have research teams there, but because obviously we're not in Bristol, but the kind of way it operates. But there are different stages, or supposedly at different stages in the EV transition, but that tends to be focused on private car uptake. So as we dig into it, we find that, for example, in Poland, it's the country is the furthest behind of our four case studies in terms of EV uptake, private EV uptake. And actually, one issue they're addressing there is that countries that are further ahead are selling their old secondhand petrol and diesel cars into Poland. So there's a very big market there for secondhand vehicles, and it ends up being the most polluting vehicles from some of the Western or Northwestern European countries that end up in Poland. So does that mean it's lagging? Well, there's other things going on. And again, thinking more than just vehicles, they have an electric tram system that they've been modernizing, and actually the cities pressured the Polish government to be able to include vehicles that travel by rail as well as on wheels by road to be included in the same funding packages for electric mobility. So things going on there. E-scooters are also taking off all over the place, very popular in Poznan in Poland. Norway, they were at 50% of new cars sold were EVs way back in 2018. So, very often held up as a front runner. And now it's 88%, so almost 90% of private cars sold in Norway are electric, which is great. But it's not quite that simple. There's good news in that it is spilling over into public transport, electrifying ferries and buses in cities. But they're actually struggling to get key user groups. So here in the UK and actually in Poland as well, there's a focus on fleets and electrifying fleet vehicles. And that's actually an area that Norwegian municipalities are struggling to get to electrify and to match up with their zero traffic growth in cities. And what's quite interesting is they, at the moment, don't have the powers to introduce a zero emission zone, but they'd like to, because although they have toll rings that benefit electric vehicles, have a massive discount on, and so, but that's not within the municipality's control. So again, it's kind of thinking about layers of governance and who can match up, say, what a taxi needs for charging in the city with what they pay to get into the city, and kind of create a package for them. In the Netherlands, it's also a very high adoption location. And e-bikes are unsurprisingly extremely popular. What's quite interesting is they've got no e-scooters there, and they briefly had electric mopeds, and those were withdrawn. But despite the fact that there's a very high mode share for people cycling, when you actually look at the kilometers traveled, it's not particularly high. So there is a real need still for other solutions. They've been looking quite a lot at the shared mobility using electric car clubs. And this is in Utrecht, has its own local startup that is using car clubs as with bidirectional charging and renewable energy, sometimes on the building it's charging from if it's in a car park attached to a building. This one isn't. But really looking at the kind of whole ecosystem of sharing the mobility, sharing the energy, and trying to encourage reduced car use and mileage that way. And in Bristol, kind of, again, quite an interesting circumstance for this conference is that they've actually decided to become their own charge point operator, which is obviously quite unusual. So not just contract, but own the assets, they operate them. This causes its own difficulties or challenges, because on the one hand, they want to respond to their residents, they want to meet demand where charging is requested, but on the other hand, they have to actually make a commercial case and be viable as a business. So they might not have to make a profit, but they need to wash their face in terms of putting those charge points out there and operating them. They also run different electric vehicle loan schemes that go across multiple vehicle types so that businesses can try out what type is best for them before they decide to invest in their fleets. They have recently changed their e-scooter operator. So their e-scooter trial is the most popular within the UK trials out of the 50 odd that went forward over the last few years. And now they've changed operator from Voy to Tier, and part of that new contract is e-bikes. So it'll be interesting to see how that takes off. Literally started a few weeks ago. And what was quite interesting is I did a bit of a comparison with their electric car clubs that they have in Bristol, with electric car clubs in Oxfordshire. And in Oxford City, electric car clubs are much more popular if people can get hold of them. So kind of people book them further in advance, people use them more than the non-electric car clubs in the city, whereas in Bristol it was about the same. So kind of what does that say about the market and things like that. So some really interesting lessons coming forward. So going into the electric car clubs more specifically, why should we be really thinking this through? Well, I don't know how many people have read through the entire zero-emission vehicle mandate, but car clubs have been included, which we think, for those of us researching in it, and it's great news. As Louise said this morning, we want to see not every petrol or diesel car being replaced with an electric car. We want to see one to at least 10, I think she said 10, but at least we want to reduce that down. And car clubs, Como UK is the shared mobility charity that has run a really fantastic survey for years now, and the most recent one shows that they replaced 22 private vehicles, and they really encourage car-light lifestyles, but there's kind of a big question mark around whether they can do that outside urban areas that have public transport, that have those other choices. There's not a lot of research on it. There is a Dutch study that showed that it was quite rare to find car clubs outside urban areas, and that it was more peer-to-peer, and the peer-to-peer didn't have that much effect on car ownership. Whereas car clubs, can, in the UK, just again, a bit of analysis that I did, that where there are car clubs, where I had the data to say there's car clubs in areas that are less dense and have higher car ownership, generally speaking, the car clubs do have an effect on vehicle ownership. So some exciting potential there. So getting on to the trial here in Oxfordshire, these are mainly in the park and charge hubs as well as at Redbridge. So these are mainly in smaller towns, market towns, and even villages. And it was agreed between Oxfordshire County Council and the car club operators that they'd take the risk of putting a car there as long as there was the space and the charge point available, and we would run it for a year and see how it was going. So this is all the places that they're in, and some of them have changed operator or started a bit later, so not all of them have been running since April this past year. But I did do, again, just a bit of analysis, and you can see that 4 of them are already getting into the membership range of established car clubs, and not just the ones in higher density, lower car ownership cities, but also in this less dense and higher car ownership areas. And actually the ones that are blank have fewer members, but that doesn't necessarily mean that those members don't use them a lot, and it was still over the 10 that was mentioned this morning. So yeah, just really quickly as well, there's a lot to deal with. There's practical concerns, peer-to-peer, and some of the other car club operators have age restrictions on insurance, which in rural areas, if there's a lot more elderly people, if you can't get insurance to drive a shared vehicle if you're over 70, that could be a problem. How easy is it to join and book? Do you actually know how to drive or charge the vehicle if you're sharing it and don't actually own it? How do you learn? Hidden costs. But we have been finding that making EVs available does make car clubs more attractive, particularly here in Oxfordshire, where EVs are so widespread. That there is an interest with that centrally run rather than peer-to-peer, and that community involvement can raise awareness, but not necessarily use. So that's a kind of tricky one to unpick, potentially. And that's it.
Thanks very much, Hannah. Really, really interesting insights there. One of the charge club point operators said that in the research that they'd been involved with, that they saw utilisation jump by 20% if it had a car club attached to it. So that's food for thought. All of our speakers, including the wonderful Sarah Hassan-Flug, who's from Oxford City Council, will be at the Learn and Share session, which is 2 o'clock this afternoon, if you want to drill down into some of the stuff that these guys and women have spoken about today. Over to Aid. Thank you.